Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into great stories and books, and another where we just dive into tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn about before the Civil War, the United States Civil War. Yes, what was happening, all the conditions that led up to the Civil War, what were the problems between North and South. And as we wrap up our series of episodes on Westward Expansion, there's tons more that we will get to. But we're going to march forward to this horrible time period in 1861 when the North went to fight against the South. Now, to understand, at this point, if you look at the map, you've got states that going west, ending there at Missouri, Iowa, Texas. You have the entire swath of the West in terms of the Rocky Mountains, completely unorganized territory. You had the Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory, Oregon Territory, and yes, even the Minnesota Territory. You had California as a state, but otherwise, the entire reason, or certainly one of the major reasons that we went to war, was this conflict about how the slave question was going to be settled as states started to be organized and admitted to the United States. So there was this Mason-Dixon line, which is this imaginary line going from east to west, the southern tip of Pennsylvania. If it was above that line, you were a free state. Slavery was not allowed. If it was south of that line, you were considered to be able to have slaves. This was all organized, and these two Englishmen, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, they had surveyed this land almost 100 years earlier, and this became this border between North and South. Now, the South's economy, the economy from my younger members of the audience is all about business, your goods and services, your products you sell, and the services that humans provide for one another. It was entirely based on agriculture, which is another word for farming. The farmlands and the weather down in the South was perfect for growing conditions and certain crops. Again, a crop is a food that is harvested to be sold. These conditions were perfect for growing cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Cotton was used for clothes. Sugar came from the sugar cane plant. And obviously we know what sugar is for. Plenty of goodies. And tobacco. And yes, tobacco was huge going back to Jamestown and Captain John Smith. John Rolfe brought a few seeds to the Jamestown area, and the economy boomed off of the back of this addictive plant that people breathe through their lungs. And at the time, it was so popular throughout the entire United States and especially in Europe. But of course, they didn't know how dangerous it was to their health. It was just addictive, and it became the backbone, like I said, of so much of the Southern economy. To pick the cotton, to pick the tobacco leaves, and yes, to cut down all this sugar cane, it required lots of manual labor, lots of work. And the plantation owners forced hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to work day after day under horrible conditions, no wages at all. I mean, if you've ever seen a cotton plant, the ball of cotton needs to come out of this cotton pod, and it's sharp. Your fingers by the end of the day would be callous, would be bleeding, and the workers would be in long rows. They would have these long canvas bags over their shoulders. A full bag could weigh up to 100 pounds in some cases, and they had to fill several of these bags a day. The tobacco, workers had to work in rows of these tall leafy plants, and they had to carefully snap off the ripe green leaves with their hands. They started with the leaves at the very bottom of the plant, so basically they were bending over throughout the day, and they had to pick the leaves at the right time and then meticulously bring them off the field to be dried. There was a lot of work here, but it was demeaning. It was not something that you look forward to waking up in the morning. And this was the foundation. This was the basis of life in the South for so many people. And yes, unfortunately, 1860, there were roughly 4 million slaves that lived in the South, making up almost 18% of the total United States population. There were slaves in the North, but it wasn't as prevalent as in the South. I mean, it's some more numbers to bring this home. In the 15 slave states in 1860, again, the Civil War started a year later in 1861, roughly 30% of white households held slaves in the South. Free people, still outnumbered enslaved people in the South, but in certain deep southern areas, enslaved people were in the majority. In 1860, Mississippi had over 430 enslaved people, outnumbering the white population of 350,000. Bottom line, though, less than 5% of all Americans own slaves. But regardless of the percentage, regardless of the numbers, it was too many. And there is a basic human dignity that, yes, written into the Declaration of Independence. It's right there in the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's there. It's in the Declaration of Independence, but yet here we are almost 100 years later, and of course it's so ironic and horrible that that's not the case with all these enslaved people from Africa. Now, getting back to the economy, the northern economy was basically industries, manufacturers, which are companies that make things. So many of the cotton that was picked in the South was sent up north, and clothes were made from that cotton. Well, the reality was the North didn't grow so many of these crops that we've talked about, cotton and tobacco and sugarcane, because it didn't have the right weather or the soil to grow them. There were plenty of farms in the North that grew corn, wheat, plenty of fruits and vegetables. And the northern farmers had livestock, cattle, sheep, and pigs. So the basis of the northern economy was not such that they needed more labor. Certainly they did need people to work, but they paid these people. In many northern cities, there was lots of trading that was going on in so much of the backbone of our new industries, iron, coal, wood. Northern cities had factories that turned the iron into steel, which was the strong metal that would be sent to other factories that made the trains, the engines, the building, bridges, tools, weapons, you name it. Bottom line is, most of the people that were employed in northern cities were in these factories making everything that was demanded of this growing country. You name it, it was made for the most part in a lot of these factories in the North. So with this foundation, you had a lot more power, you had a lot more people, and therefore a lot more influence up north. But again, our country was a representative democracy, meaning that laws could not be passed unless a majority of the people ended up coming along and agreed to compromise for the greater good. But when you had half of the country down south in terms of representation with all the states, and now you're going further west, so to maintain the interest with the southern people that want to stay in power, you needed to have more representatives, which meant when the states were admitted to the Union, they needed to have these states reflect the needs of the South, which included continuing slavery. This was the powder keg that did not light right away, but it was simmering for many years leading up to 1861. Some of the forces that started the process of the division of our country were the abolitionists. Abolitionists were people who wanted to abolish or end slavery. Some of the prevailing people in the North that became very famous throughout this process was an original slave who became very famous in the North, Frederick Douglass. There was a fellow by the name of Wendell Smith and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony later, with her work, she ended up fighting for the cause of women along with, obviously, enslaved people. Another famous abolitionist was Harriet Tubman. A lot of you have heard about her. She not only helped enslaved Africans escape along this underground railroad, she also went around talking to people in the North, making the case that slavery should be abolished. Definitely a future episode on Harriet Tubman. She has an amazing life. But while many of these abolitionists were nonviolent, many were not. A lot of people were not. And the lead up to the Civil War, definitely future episodes. One was at Harper's Ferry. An abolitionist named John Brown tried to get guns and weapons delivered literally to some of the slaves, and he rebelled against the plantation owners. That was a major event. There was another slave named Nat Turner. He led a bunch of slaves that rebelled against plantation owners in Virginia. And then there was another enslaved African. His name was Denmark Vesey. He helped plan a huge rebellion against some plantation owners in South Carolina. His plan was discovered before it carried out, but as you could see, more and more people were rising up against an institution that was not fair. Now, just to make sure this is clear, this all came about, this whole division came about with the Mexican-American War and the fact that we now had all this new land that was added to the United States. States needed to be admitted. I mentioned this before. But why was this an issue? Well, it was all about Congress. You see, every time a state was added, each state would get 2 senators. If slave states and free states stayed in equal number, neither side would have more power than the other and everything would be fine. But if one side gained more states, in other words, more states entering the Union became, let's say in this example, non-slave states, slavery not allowed, then that side, in this case, the North, could gain more influence over national laws. The more representatives you have that favor one cause over another, and this slavery issue was the big issue. Now, this entered politics. Politics is all about getting along. Politics is all about our government and people making laws. Well, the first crisis, as I mentioned, coming out of the War of 1812 was 1820. There came to be this compromise. It was called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri wanted to become a state, but Missouri planned to allow slavery. At that time, the country had 11 free states and 11 slave states, equal, like I talked about before. If Missouri entered as the slave state, the balance would be broken. The solution was called this Compromise of 1820. Here's what Congress decided. Missouri would enter as a slave state, but Maine would enter as a free state. That kept the numbers balanced. But there was another important rule. Congress also drew the line across the Louisiana Territory. North of that line, slavery would be banned. South of the line, slavery would continue. For a while, it seemed like the problem had been solved, but no, of course, it wasn't. It was just kicking the can down the road. So now it's 1850. The Mexican-American War is over, and like I mentioned, we now have all these huge, vast territories in the West. Would slavery continue and spread into these lands to prevent the country from breaking apart because talks were already happening in 1850? Remember, the war didn't start until 11 years later. Congress passed this complicated deal called the Compromise of 1850. It included several parts. California would now enter the Union as a free state. Some Western territories would decide the slavery question for themselves. This seemed like an interesting compromise, but as you'll see later, it was just a complete debacle waiting to happen. Think about it. States would be entering the Union, specifically Kansas, and we'll get to this, that said, you know what? We're not going to determine, the federal government, whether you're slave or not slave. You guys in Kansas will determine it. Well, the other part of the compromise, in many people's eye, was the final straw that broke the camel's back, that broke the metaphorical country in half. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was what the South pushed through. It was a law that required citizens, even in the North and free states, to help capture slaves that had left the South, that had escaped from the South, and return them to their plantation owners. It infuriated not just people that were abolitionists in the North, but it infuriated regular people all throughout the country, but mostly people in the North, because they literally saw the degradation of humans in chains being captured and brought back down here in our country. And a famous example happened with a guy by the name of Anthony Burns. He had escaped from slavery in Virginia, made his way to Boston, where slavery was illegal. So for a short time, he was living and working as a free man. But in 1854, his former plantation owner discovered where he was and used this Fugitive Slave Act to demand his return. Federal authorities arrested Burns in Boston. The people were furious. A crowd of regular people actually attempted to break into the building where he was being held. The federal government. Now, we'll get back to this. Think about this. This is not just people from the South. This is the federal government, which is part of, obviously, the North. This is one government, one country. They responded by sending hundreds of soldiers to enforce the law. Burns was marched through the street of Boston in chains, guarded by troops, and placed on a ship to send him back to slavery in Virginia. For many Northerners, this sight, seeing it in person, was shocking. A man who had been living freely has now been seized and forced back into slavery, with their government helping to make it happen. So you can understand how this powder keg exploded in this moment. Now, you may be thinking, how is it that most people in the South have really agreed to ultimately have us become two nations, to move away from the United States of America? They often talked about it being not about slavery, but about determining their own future, the rights of the states. And as many historians have pointed out, think about this. How ironic is this, that this is a federal law, and now the North, in their state of Massachusetts, cannot determine that, in fact, no, you can't take one of our free people and return them to the South. How ironic. So this was the push and pull between both sides. And now, how about this? It could be argued that the average person, both in North and South, that necessarily weren't involved with plantations, weren't involved with politics per se and having slaves, they would just be going about their business. But it wasn't politics. It wasn't people in government. It wasn't even a rebellion at this point. But the next year in 1852, a book changed the entire conversation about what was right and what was wrong in our country. This little lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe published this novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story followed slaves and showed the cruelty and heartbreak of what was happening. Readers saw families being separated, people being hurt, abused, and saw the human suffering in the pages of this book that just came alive in the consciousness of so many average Americans. The book was so popular. Millions of copies were sold. Like I said, many readers who had never even seen slavery suddenly felt its impact. In the South, people were furious. They said the book exaggerated the truth and unfairly attacked their way of life. And as Abraham Lincoln famously said when he finally met Harriet, he said, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war," unquote. Now, I mentioned about the fact that these new territories, they could decide their own fate. And yes, now it was written into law, 1854. It was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But ultimately, this became known as Bleeding Kansas. People arrived into this new territory, and they said, well, this is not going to happen. Kansas can't grow cotton. Kansas is not going to support slavery. So North went along with this compromise, assuming that it wouldn't be a reality, wouldn't be an issue, but it became, because literally both sides arrived with guns. And I say this as a metaphor because, yes, ultimately, violence started right away. Houses were burned, people were attacked, armed groups fought against each other. It became known as Bleeding Kansas, like I said. It was another preview as a lead up to the war. Behind the scenes, along this time, there were new political parties that were struggling with this whole issue. For many years, there were two political parties, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democrats were the Jacksonian Democrats with Andrew Jackson. And yes, it was the beginning of today's Democratic Party. But the slavery issue, like I said, drove both of the parties apart. In the 1850s, a new political group was formed, the Republican Party. And yes, this is today's Republican Party. It started with abolitionists that wanted slavery to be outlawed, but it grew into a party that became all about ending slavery, specifically with the adoption of all the new states in the West. And into this moment arrives Abraham Lincoln. He grew up poor. He was a frontier family. He taught himself everything. He taught himself law, and yes, he became a politician. He was thoughtful, he was calm, and yeah, he was opposed to the spread of slavery into the new territories. Well, now it's 1860. A new presidential election is happening. He runs for president as a candidate of the Republican Party. He didn't promise to end slavery where it already existed, but he did promise to stop it from expanding westward. Many voters in the North, this sounded reasonable. Many leaders in the South, nope, this was completely unacceptable and dangerous. When Lincoln won the election, the Southern leaders said, nope, that's it. This is unacceptable. There's no way we're going to have a fair representation in Congress. No way we're going to have a fair representation in our national government. This is unacceptable. One by one, the Southern states began leaving the Union. They formed a new country called the Confederate States of America. The United States was now split in two. Even then, some Americans hoped war could not be avoided. But now, by the following year in 1861, Lincoln is president, and the tensions were rising around federal forts. Keep in mind, the South, they left. But there was still national government forts all throughout the South. One of those forts stood in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. It was Fort Sumter. In April 1861, Confederate forces demanded that the Union soldiers surrender inside the fort. They refused. Early on the morning of April 12th, Confederate cannons opened fire. The bombardment lasted for more than a day. Finally, the Union troops surrendered. These cannon blasts marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. What had once been arguments in Congress, what had once been arguments and debates just in newspapers, people, regular people just thinking that, you know what, we'll be able to continue to compromise, now became a shooting war. The can had now stopped being kicked down the road. It was standing right in front of us, and we had to deal with it. This war would forever change our country, and it all began with this long, complicated road that was before the Civil War. Friends, thanks for staying with me on this journey. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group, OK Let's Learn. We are now on YouTube. Yes, just search for OK Let's Learn, and you'll find the podcast right there. Always love those 5-star reviews, the ratings, everything. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.